all set?
Yeah.
Started, I think.
I have an opening statement.
Yeah. The committee will come to order. We are meeting this morning to consider 7 different bills within the committee's jurisdiction. We will consider each bill individually with a separate opening statement and walkthrough for each. The first order of business is a bill introduced by Human Resources Chairman Mr. Reichart and Human Resources Ranking Member Mr. Doggett to prevent sex trafficking of youth in foster care. Mr. Reichart, you are now recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for placing this legislation on the agenda of the committee today. H.R. 4058 is a bipartisan bill that I strongly believe can prevent sex trafficking, especially of young people in foster care. I'm pleased to have worked with my colleague and ranking member of the Human Resources Subcommittee, Mr. Doggett, and I thank our colleagues on both sides of the aisle who have become co-sponsors. Before being elected to Congress, I was sheriff of King County, and I spent over 32 years working in law enforcement. And I saw firsthand the tragedies kids face when they're not cared for by loving parents, when they run away and when they end up on the streets. On August 12th of 1982, I was called to investigate the death of a young woman whose body was found in Kent, Washington, which has a river running through it called the Green River. Little did I know that that day, by finding this victim, would begin a 2-decade hunt for a man who became known as the Green River Killer. Once caught, he finally admitted to killing and confessed to 49 murders, and he probably killed somewhere between 60 and 70 young women. The first known victim of the Green River Killer was Wendy Caulfield. She was 16 years old when she died. Wendy was living in a foster home when she ran away, but because she'd run away before, no one was really looking for her. We need to do more to protect kids like Wendy, and that's why we're all here today. To better understand this issue, we've had 3 subcommittee hearings in the past year in which we brought in experts and survivors to talk about ways to strengthen our current system. Our witnesses included young women and girls who have been through the system. Noelle Gomez, Mandy Urweiler, Wilma T. Ortez, and Talitha James. They were foster kids in human trafficking and or avoided human trafficking, were approached to be involved in human trafficking, and these young ladies had the courage to come forward and tell their story to Congress. And by the way, one of our witnesses, Miss T. Ortiz Walker Pettigrew, was named last week by Time magazine as one of the most 100 influential people in the world. T experienced firsthand the nightmare of being a victim of child sex trafficking. And after hearing from her and many other experts, Congressman Doggett and I introduced bipartisan legislation to help every state better protect youth in foster care from sex trafficking. Our bill would require states to identify victims and provide them with the services they need to heal. It would also improve data on instances of child sex trafficking. On a preventative front, the bill makes sure that youth can participate in age-appropriate activities so they are less vulnerable to trafficking, and encourages states to move children out of foster care and into loving families more quickly. The approach we are taking is practical, bipartisan, and based on state experience. Our bill incorporates a wide range of ideas gleaned from bills introduced by members like Mr. Paulson, as well as ideas from over 150 pages of public comments we received on our December discussion draft. I'm confident that this legislation will ensure that all states take real steps to better understand the problem and keep kids safe while in foster care, and I urge all members to support it. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Levin, you're now recognized for an opening statement on the bill.
I have an opening statement on the other bills, but on this bill I yield to Mr. Doggett.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, there is considerable bipartisan agreement behind this proposal. Indeed, 8 Democratic members of the committee and 11 Republicans are sponsors of this legislation. This markup follows a subcommittee hearing on the issue of preventing sex trafficking for children in foster youth that we had in October. We posted the draft bill for public comment in December and have received a number of comments. And we introduced the bill in February. Myself, Chairman Reichert, Chairman Camp, and a number of other committee members. The Children's Defense Fund has said that this measure, quote, strengthens the child welfare system to help prevent children and youth in foster care from becoming victims of sex trafficking in the future. However, I am very disappointed to have learned for the first time yesterday that the substitute that will be offered momentarily eliminates an important provision that would ensure that older children who are discharged from foster care are provided with important documents upon their release: a copy of their birth certificate, their Social Security card, and their medical records. Now, think a minute about who these children are who would get these documents. These are children who stand among the least in our society. They've been removed from their parents because of physical abuse or neglect. Many of these cases are so horrendous that it is difficult to consider the details, and they're lucky to have survived. Then that same child often gets passed around from one foster home to another as the child grows. They have no sense of stability or belonging to a family, school, or community in many cases. And then for most of these children, when they reach 18, they don't get a birthday cake with 18 candles. They're told, you're on your own. Good luck. Find a job. You're out of foster care. And often this is in areas where youth unemployment is soaring. Is it any wonder why a number of young women who, the term is age out of foster care, prostitute themselves and become victims of sex traffickers? Is it any wonder that so many of these foster youth are now in our criminal justice system, subsidized by the taxpayers after having done harm to a neighbor? Indeed, when I met with a number of people working with these youth last week in San Antonio, I learned that only about 2% of them actually end up going to college. Many get additional taxpayer assistance only in the form of the criminal justice system. I support the bipartisan provision that was included in the bill that was posted that says at least give them a Social Security card, a birth certificate, and the information on health records that they obtained through the foster system so that they'll be more likely to get a job and less likely to get in trouble. This provision has been removed not because it's not worthy, not because it doesn't have bipartisan support. In fact, I think Senator Orrin Hatch first advanced it, but for one and only one reason. It costs a little more than $1 million a year for the states to implement that they can charge back to the federal government on their administrative costs. Compare this with the other bills on today's agenda. Against the huge tax breaks that the committee is considering today, the amount of this amendment for some of our most desperate young people is a pittance. If you ever needed to see a concrete example of the trade-offs between corporate tax breaks and support for the most vulnerable in our society, it can be found right here in the little more than $1 million a year that is being denied to young people to have a better chance of getting a job, something that even my home state of Texas does already, not known for its generosity and services. So I support the bill, I support the technical changes, but I would offer an amendment to at least give these children a chance in the future to get a job by having the documents that they need. The cost of this is hours or days of the unpaid $310 billion of corporate tax bills that the committee is about to pursue. I think that there's justification for providing this small bit of assistance to our most vulnerable youth at a time that we are responding so generously to what seem to be invulnerable corporate interest, and I yield back.
The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 4058. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Mr. Matt Whitinger, Staff Director for the Human Resources Subcommittee, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and I would ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 4058 is designed to identify and prevent sex trafficking involving children in the nation's foster care system, among other purposes. As Chairman Riker and Ranking Member Doggett noted, the legislation was introduced in February, incorporating comments received from the public after the committee released a draft version of this legislation in December. The legislation builds on a series of hearings by the Human Resources Subcommittee in the past year, during which the subcommittee received testimony from several young women who had themselves been victimized by sex trafficking, among other experts on this issue. The legislation includes findings and 3 titles. Title I includes a series of changes designed to better identify and protect youth in the foster care system who are at risk of sex trafficking. For example, Section 101 requires state child welfare agencies to develop procedures for identifying foster youth to determine whether they are at risk of becoming a victim of sex trafficking, so appropriate services can be provided to protect them. Title II includes a series of provisions designed to improve the normalcy of youth in foster care and their prospects for success in life. The intent is that participation in normal activities will help insulate more foster youth from sex trafficking, among other negative outcomes. For example, Section 201 addresses concerns that current foster care rules unintentionally prevent foster youth from participating in high school sports, attending a sleepover, holding a part-time job, or learning how to drive a car. Thus, states are required to train foster parents, as well as youth, in reasonable and prudent standards of risk, and encourage youth participation in age and developmentally appropriate activities. Title III improves data collection and reporting on sex trafficking among children in foster care, so improved policies can be developed in the future to prevent and address it. The Chairman's amendment in the nature of substitute includes a series of almost exclusively technical amendments to H.R. 4058 as introduced that were suggested by the Congressional Research Service. As the Chairman noted, a green sheet has been distributed with the Chairman's amendment that describes the location and nature of those changes. I note that the sole substantive change reflected in the Chairman's amendment is the removal of Section 204 of the bill as introduced. Mr. Chairman, that completes my walkthrough.
All right, thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Whitinger?
I have a question.
Mr. Doggett?
Why was Section 204 removed?
Go ahead.
Well, I can provide background on Section 204. I think
There was bipartisan agreement to do so.
Well, there was no bipartisan agreement for me to do so. It was removed solely because of this $1 million a year cost, wasn't it?
That's not correct, but look, I'd be happy to work with the member on this issue as we move forward out of committee, but there was a lot of discussion about this, and there was bipartisan agreement to do so.
Bipartisan agreement with whom? I'm unaware that there was any agreement to deny documents to these young people, and I wasn't even notified about it until last night.
Before this bill goes to the floor, I'd be happy to work with the gentleman from Texas regarding this issue. There was quite a bit of discussion of this. I regret the member was uninformed about it, but like I said, I'll be glad to work with you as we move forward before we go to the floor.
Mr. Chairman, we have worked in a bipartisan way on this previously, and I believe that the Senate committee has approved a measure with this in it unanimously, and I take it that while there are no guarantees, you're saying you'll work to try to find a way to put this back in, and there are there not in the bill already approximately $3 million, is it over 10, that is not paid for as shown in the score?
Look, you've said more than I've committed to. What I am saying is I'd be happy to work with you to try to resolve this issue before the bill comes to the floor. Obviously, I can't make a promise that it's going to go back in as is because there's been bipartisan agreement to take it out. But I understand the gentleman's concern. And as I said, I'd be happy to work with you on it.
Well, I'm raising two different questions. Then, first, what does it mean to work with me if we're not going to consider putting the measure in?
Well, we'll consider it, but I thought you said I would agree to try to put it back in. I certainly would consider trying to address the gentleman's concerns, but I'm not going to make an ironclad agreement that you'll get your way.
Mr. Whitinger, is the provision involved here in a bill that has been approved by the Senate Finance Committee?
That's correct. The so-called documents provision was in a bill that the Senate Finance Committee approved in December of last year.
And are there other provisions in this bill that do total about $3 million, cost over 10, that do not have a pay-for yet?
The committee, of course, doesn't receive a formal cost estimate until the legislation is reported, but informally we're informed that the chairman's amendment as drafted would increase costs by about $3 million over 5 years.
And in order to bring this bill to the floor, you would need to find some way of paying for that consistent with House rules.
That's correct.
And so if this provision were added to the bill, you'd need to come up with about another $1 million a year in pay-fors.
Again, subject to the informal nature of the CBO estimates and so forth, yes.
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
We're not prepared to go to that quite yet.
Okay.
But I understand you will. Any other questions? Mr. Paulson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank you for bringing this legislation forward. I also want to thank Subcommittee Chairman Reichert and Ranking Member Doggett for their leadership on a very, very important issue and allowing me to work with them on some of the provisions of the bill that were part of some legislation that I introduced with Congresswoman Slaughter, and acknowledge the great work great partnership that she had with me. You know, there are a lot of issues that divide Washington, but this is one of those issues where there's agreement and there's bipartisan and bicameral work that's being done. You know, in January, I met a girl named Anne Marie, and she was a foster child who was raised in a home who had a history of abuse. And Anne Marie was in the foster care system, and she eventually found herself a victim in the world of sex trafficking. And sadly, the foster care system, as we know now, is ripe with opportunity for predators who exploit young girls just like Anne Marie. Youth who have been involved in the foster care system are much more likely to become runaways or homeless at an early age. And youth who age out at the foster care system often have little or no income support, limited housing options, and then they're at risk to end up on the streets. On any given night in Minnesota, 2,500 youth experience homelessness. And so it's very clear there's a strong connection between homelessness youth and sex trafficking victims. And a large majority of homeless youth are solicited for sex within 48 hours of becoming homeless. In order to prevent youth from becoming victims of sex trafficking, we need better information as to what's happening, where, and to whom. And so, Mr. Chairman, we need to identify the trends and help fill in the gaps. This legislation does that. And the bill will also address that lack of reliable data and reporting to law enforcement with information that is related to runaway youth in the child welfare system. We need to protect and help these victims before they're trafficked. And this bill, I think, is just one more important step that we can take to address sex trafficking. I look forward to its passage and working with other members of the committee and in the House on other initiatives to help our most vulnerable youth. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Reichert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of quick points to reemphasize regarding your comments. And that is, it's also my understanding that the Democrat staff were informed of this change last week and supported removing these documents and this provision in the chairman's amendment. We will continue to work together as the legislation advances to find bipartisan pay-fors for the remaining small costs that are included in this bill. And we expect to be able to do that before this reaches the floor. So I hope that gives Mr. Doggett and some of the other members some encouragement. I yield back.
You and I were discussing this. Mr. Reichert, could you repeat that so that we all hear how far you're willing to go? None of this is paid for yet, right?
Well, sir, my comments were certainly the Democrat staff knew. There was a claim that there was no knowledge, but our staffs have worked together, and it's my information that we've worked with your staff, and they were aware of the change. They also were aware of the fact that we were willing to work together, and we are willing to work together. And the other point is that, as has been mentioned, the Senate has passed their version of the bill, and it does include the cost related to this item with identification. And there's an opportunity there for us to negotiate and see where we can agree upon. But I'm in agreement with the chairman that we are certainly open to hearing your ideas and working together with you.
Mr. Riker. Mr. Chairman.
Let me go to Mr. Davis.
And I just want to associate myself with the remarks made by Mr. Doggett, and I'm pleased to hear you indicate that you're willing to work to try and
Yes.
resolve that issue. I think it's a very important one, and I think it's something that can be resolved, and I simply would urge you to move ahead with that.
Yes, and let me just say that when I was a member of the Human Resources Subcommittee many years ago, we were very much concerned with children aging out of foster care and not having a driver's license and not having any ability to move forward with their lives. And so I understand the importance of this issue, and maybe I can make this a little more clear. I will work with the gentleman to see if this can be included in the bill. There are concerns about how we address that, but having said that, I'm happy to try to resolve this going forward. And this is an area that I am familiar with. It's an area that I've worked on as a member of Human Resources in the past. So, but at this point, I would like to proceed if we can. So, are there any other questions? All right. We'll now, at this point, there being no further questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman will suspend while the clerk distributes the amendment.
And Mr. Chairman, I would reserve a point of order.
Gentleman reserves a point of order.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from Texas.
I would like to reserve or withdraw my point of order.
The point of order is withdrawn.
I haven't decided.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your comments. My goal is to get this provision restored and to work with you in a constructive way to do so, but I do want to clarify the record on this. My understanding is that the only discussion with staff was to point out that a cost had been found for doing this that the states would incur, and they could seek reimbursal as they do in other ways, and that therefore the cost of this provision to the federal government would be about $1 million a year in additional costs. And the presentation was to the effect of, do you have a pay-for to cover that? And the Democratic staff is not the only folks around here responsible for finding pay-fors and could not identify one at the time, and therefore the provision was removed. In other words, the provision was removed to address the needs of these at-risk kids who are basically dumped on the street in many cases, can't find employment, don't have other means of supporting themselves, and too many of them turn to prostitution. And I thought that this provision, which I did not originally conceive, was a modest way of addressing that. At least say so they can go flip burgers or do whatever other task they might do, that they'll have a Social Security card, that they'll have their health records to show their employer, and that they'll be a little bit more employable. And it just smacks of such inconsistency to, on this day, lead off with a bill that has this key provision removed that cost only about $1 million a year and not be concerned about approving $310 billion. In other words, the cost of this bill, as currently drafted, is maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 days of the unpaid tax breaks that are about to be approved in the committee. It is a cost that is very real, and it is a trade-off. It is a question of whether we provide some minimal services to help these desperate young people, and that we insist that that must be paid for, as I think it should be, but that we are unwilling to pay for provisions, some of which, frankly, I don't think are worth being paid for, but we're unwilling to pay for any of the provisions in the corporate tax breaks that are being considered today. It is an incredible conflict in priorities where we can't do $1 million a year for desperate youth, but we can do $310 billion over the next 10 years in significant corporate tax breaks that are not being paid for. I think it's wrong. I think it's the wrong set of priorities. The Senate has already approved a bill with this provision in there. Since my goal is to try to get this included in the bill, I will work with you going on to the floor to see if there isn't some way to get the bill that 11 Republican members of this committee have already co-sponsored with this provision in there, a provision that was posted and got comments for several months from the public, none rejecting this, and to have it removed for the cost of about $1 million a year is just flat wrong. And I hope we can work together. I viewed your initial, I appreciated your clarifying your initial comments that there's not a commitment to restore it, but there is a commitment to at least work in good faith to see if there isn't some reasonable way to pay for this provision, unlike what we're doing on the corporate tax break, some reasonable way to pay for it so that this minimal level of help might be available to these young people.
All right, thank you. Mr. Reichert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill, remember, does a number of things to hopefully keep kids out of foster care into permanent. Our goal is to get them into permanent homes. So, in working with states, we identify victims of child sex trafficking, determine appropriate services for the child. We improve data on child sex trafficking and services provided to the victims. We ensure that youth in foster care can lead more normal lives, working and living in a family structure. And we ensure states do more to quickly move kids out of foster care and into permanent homes. And coupled with our adoption legislation that we passed recently, this is really the goal. This bill does so many good things and needs to move forward now. There has been a decision made to remove that certain section that you've talked about, but again, you've got the commitment of the chairman, the commitment of myself as the chairman of the subcommittee, and I know other members on this panel that are in agreement with your thoughts and want to see these things move forward. The point, again, would make is that if this was left in the bill today, it would have prevented the whole bill from moving forward. And I think that's too high of a price to pay for any single provision, given all the other excellent policies that I've just laid out before the committee. So,
gentlemen, yield.
I will yield.
The section that I want to restore, you think is a good idea, don't you? So the substantive, I understand you're concerned about the cost, but substantively, you think it's valuable.
I think this bill is a good idea, and I think we ought to
And
move
the bill is moving forward with a fiscal note, just not without this provision. And having heard your say-so and your willingness to work, not a guarantee that it gets added, but to try to see that it gets restored in the legislative process at the appropriate time, Mr. Chairman, I will withdraw the amendment. But I think it is really important to try to get this restored. And had I known about it in a timely way, I would have worked with you on it to see if there wasn't a better solution than we are achieving today.
All right, the amendment is withdrawn. Are there any additional amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 4058 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, may I request a roll call vote?
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson? Aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady? Aye. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan? Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Teaberry? Aye. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Aye. Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Price? Aye. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith? Aye. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock? Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Aye. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin? Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Levin?
Aye.
Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Rangel? Aye. Mr. Rangel, aye. Mr. McDermott? Aye. Mr. McDermott, aye. Mr. Lewis? Aye. Mr. Lewis, aye. Mr. Neal? Mr. Becerra? Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, aye. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, aye. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kind? Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, aye. Ms. Schwartz? Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, aye. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, aye. Mr. Nunez?
Aye.
Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Schock? Aye. Mr. Schock, aye. Mr. Griffin? Mr. Neal? Mr. Becerra? Aye. Mr. Becerra, aye. Mr. Kind? Mr. Pascrell? Ms. Schwartz? Chairman Camp?
Aye. The clerk will report the vote.
33 ayes, 0 nays.
There being 33 ayes and 0 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 4058 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. And without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. The next order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Brady and Mr. Larson related to the research credit. Mr. Brady, you are now recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for bringing this bill up. It is a measure that, while I and Mr. Larson are proud to lead, this was led originally by you and Mr. Levin as well. America is the world's leading innovator, developing life-saving technologies, state-of-the-art computer systems, and breakthrough manufacturing products. But we're losing ground to competitors around the world. The U.S. share of global research and development has fallen from 39% in 1999 to 31% today, while China's share has increased fourfold. In fact, China's R&D spending is expected to surpass that of the United States within 8 years. Other countries are moving ahead of us by offering stronger incentives to attract research and development and the good-paying jobs that go with it to their markets. In fact, the U.S. has dropped to 27th on the list of the top countries that offer R&D incentives. It's time we get back on the playing field by modernizing the American R&D tax credit and keeping American jobs and innovation here at home. This year, we have simplified the language and given more prominence to the alternative simplified credit, but otherwise have not changed the underlying function or purpose of the bill. As in years past, our legislation would simplify and strengthen the U.S. credit by increasing the alternative simplified credit from 14% to 20%, and more importantly, making it permanent. The credit would apply equally to all companies that perform R&D in the United States, would modernize the credit by simplifying and strengthening it. Increasing the alternative simplified credit rate to 20% would allow companies to increase their current R&D spending, attract new R&D spending, and add American jobs. It's also important to provide certainty for companies that make long-term investments in R&D. On average, R&D projects take 5 to 10 years. Making the credit permanent would provide companies the confidence they need to make those long-term investments. Chairman, this is an important step forward for American competitiveness, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Levin, you're now recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are some merits to the 6 tax provisions being considered today. For example, I am among those who have favored extending the research and experimentation tax credit, among other provisions. But the manner in which Republicans are proceeding, selecting 6 of the approximately 60 tax provisions that expired last year to make permanent without any offsets, is both fiscally irresponsible and fundamentally hypocritical, and its implications are deeply troublesome. The Joint Committee on Taxation has estimated that the bills without an offset would add a combined $310 billion to the deficit. To put that figure in context, that total represents more than 1/2 of the entire federal deficit this year, which I should note is the lowest it has been since President Obama took office. That total represents nearly 2/3 of all non-defense domestic discretionary spending in 2014. It is more than 3 times what we spend annually on education, job training, and social services. It is 5 times more than we spend on veterans, and it is 5 times more than we spend on medical research and public health. Left to an uncertain fate are provisions like the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, the American Opportunity Tax Credit, the New Markets Tax Credit, and the Renewable Energy Tax Credits, as well as the long-range status of the EITC and the Child Tax Credit. To say that Republican action today is hypocritical is a serious understatement. 4 months ago, Republicans let emergency unemployment insurance expire for more than 1.3 million Americans. The total is now 2.5 million, by arguing that an adequate offset had yet to be proposed. In early April, the Senate came to a bipartisan agreement on an offset after months of painstaking negotiations. yet House Republicans still refuse to act. Every day, I, among others, receive letters from people affected. One mother of 4 from Decatur, Illinois, wrote last week that she is on the verge, as she said, of losing everything. In quotes, "I feel as if I have worked my whole life and never asked for a handout, and now I am barely making ends meet," she wrote. Mr. Chairman, it wasn't long ago that you declared, and I quote, that the path to our economic recovery starts with fiscal responsibility in Washington. This approach today of Republicans flies smack in the face of fiscal responsibility. Fiscal responsibility should not simply be a slogan. I yield back.
The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 4438, which was distributed in advance. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Mr. Tom Barthold, Chief of Staff to the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. I would ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Levin, you have before you 2 documents prepared by my colleagues, JCX 38, which describes the underlying bill, and JCX 44, the green sheet, which describes the amendment. In short, the proposal before you makes permanent the alternative simplified method for calculating the research credit and increases the credit rate to 20%. The proposal repeals the traditional 20% fixed base method. The chairman's amendment, the nature of substitute, makes a technical clarifying change to the language. The Section 41 credit under the proposal would be a permanent provision of law.
All right. Thank you. Are there any questions? Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are 4.5 years after the recession ended. As President Obama said, the economic emergency is over. The unemployment rate has dropped from a peak of 10% to now 6.7%, may well tick down another notch at the end of this week. The unemployment rate has fallen in all 50 states. The economic emergency is over. Now we go about the hard work of creating jobs in a bipartisan way. The House has already moved a number of key job creation legislation, including the Keystone XL pipeline, but today we take on bipartisan support for job-creating measures within the tax provisions. Today, at this moment, we deal with the good-paying jobs in research and development. So as the committee proposed to simplify the R&D tax credit to the alternative simplified credit only, it's vital that we be certain that the ASC can be used by businesses on amended returns. Currently, businesses can elect only the traditional R&D tax credit on amended return, not the ASC, but small companies depend on the alternative simplified credit. This restriction, as you may recall, was published in the IRS regulations temporarily, 2008, was made permanent earlier this year. Prohibiting taxpayers from electing the ASC on amended returns proves significantly burdensome for America's small and medium-sized businesses. Amended returns are not R&D specific, and all citizens and companies, as you know, can file amended returns up to 3 years back. Therefore, because of this regulation, thousands of our nation's most innovative small and medium businesses are prohibited from taking advantage of the R&D tax credit as intended by Congress. In your opinion, Mr. Barthold, will the bill and the chairman's amendment now allow businesses to claim the ASC on amended returns? And if the bill becomes law, will taxpayers be able to claim the reformed credit on an amended return?
Mr. Brady, by restructuring the credit and repealing the basic credit, there is no longer an election. So we believe that would make the present regulation inoperable.
Thank you, Mr. Barthold. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Barthold, could you explain for the committee a little bit what it means when the base credit is repealed and that firms won't be trying to calculate their research expenses in connection with a base amount? What does that mean exactly?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. As in effect, prior to the beginning of this year, there were two options by which one could create, one could calculate eligible expenses for credit. One, the older method, which I referred to as the fixed base method, looks at a period from the late 1980s of qualifying research expenditures by the taxpayer and compares current expenditures to those base amounts, and that base amount's fixed from the late 1980s, inflated for inflation, but compares your current expenditures to that fixed base amount. The amount above the fixed base would be the eligible amount for expenditures. The alternative simplified credit, which the proposal would make permanent, rather than looking back to a 25-year historic period, looks back just at the prior 3 years' average expenses and compares your current expenditures to the average of recent past expenditures. And the amount above 50% of that average is qualifying expenditure for purpose of the credit.
And as you point out, the research credit has been a temporary measure.
Yes, it expired, Section 41 expired after December 31st of 2013. It's currently an expired provision.
So obviously it has expired in other years as well.
Yes, I don't recall off the top of my head how many times, but it has in the past.
So permanency will bring certainly some certainty to this ability for businesses to use this.
It's long been a point that you and many of the members have commented upon.
I've often been told that Michigan uses the research and development tax credit more than any other state. Do you have any data on that?
We don't, the short answer is no, we don't break analysis down by state. In some respects, it would be difficult because businesses that might be headquartered in your home state may have some of their research facilities in other locations where they operate as well.
All right. Thank you. Any other questions? Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would only say this, and I'm going to yield to our leader. This could be an enormous triumph today for not only R&D tax credits and the country and jobs, and by the bipartisanship that Mr. Brady discussed. I want to commend him and the staff for the work that's been done here. But as you heard Mr. Levin say, and I want to yield to him directly, on this side of the aisle, we are in unanimity over the fact that we're leaving out and prioritizing areas that people have supported throughout their whole career here, both on this committee and before then. And that flat out just isn't right. I yield to our leader, Mr. Levin.
Thank you. I stated our position at the beginning to put forth a bill costing $310 billion, increasing the deficit by that amount, and not paying attention to other needs, and the impact of adding $310 billion to the deficit on discretionary spending on other programs is fiscally irresponsible. And I said at the beginning, it flies smack in the face of what the chairman and others have said was the key to the future, and that was fiscal responsibility. This is fiscal irresponsibility, Mr. Larson. Thank you for yielding.
I would just like to point out that this bill has been extended, unpaid for, probably 30 times. The Senate also extended this provision for 2 years, unpaid for. Again, what we're trying to get out of is sort of this uncertainty regarding something that's clearly reached broad bipartisan consensus that it should be extended and that we shouldn't raise taxes other places in order to do that. I also want to point out to my friend from Connecticut that this is the beginning of this process with extenders. This is not the end of this process. There will be other areas, but we have to start somewhere. And I think having 60 bills before the committee in one particular day would be unworkable. So we're starting with bills that have had bipartisan co-sponsors, have been introduced. This was introduced with bipartisan support as a permanent bill, and that's the bill the committee's taking up. So I just want to say we're not done. This is the beginning of, it's going to be a process of looking at this and other extenders. And look, I would just say, with regard to the EUC program, that's been extended 12 times at a cost of $260 billion, most of it added to the debt. And I think that would another extension work when the first $260 billion really hasn't? If the problem is as difficult as some would say. We've ended unemployment in the past, unemployment benefits in the past, with unemployment at a higher rate than it is now. So as Mr. Brady said, I think it's an appropriate time to do that. We've never had a program running as long as EUC did before in the history of the country, or so many months after unemployment started falling. But again, what this is about is how now do we move into a way to create jobs, to bring certainty to a provision that innovators in America need to use. How do we simplify it? How do we improve it? So again, I think that clearly trying to pass something that is retroactive for 4 months, as EUC would be, state administrators have come forward and said that is completely unworkable. And it won't add jobs to the economy. This provision, we've had testimony before this committee that this provision will add jobs to the economy. So I would just suggest that this is something that is the start of a process that is going to continue, and we will have other items before us. Are there any other questions? Mr. Johnson. Oh, I'm sorry. Any other questions?
I'll take some time for that.
I'll yield to the gentleman.
I hope we haven't started on the path of endless fiscal irresponsibility. And to say more is coming, no offset, is worrisome in terms of our priorities in this country. Let me just say a word about, Mr. Chairman.
Can I just say, we have not offset this in the past, have we?
We haven't made it permanent.
But
we've had 1-year extensions. I'll take back my time. Now and then 2. We paid for it once, the extenders, Democrats, as I remember it. This is the first time we will have ever added $310 billion to the deficit, and more to come. When you put together a tax reform proposal, which we did not just slam what we said, we disagreed with parts. We were sorry it wasn't bipartisan after you and I set up the working groups. We had some serious doubts, but at least when you made things permanent, you paid for it. This is the opposite of what you did in your tax reform proposal. Now, let me just say a word. I hope no one on this committee is slamming the door on extension of unemployment insurance. We have never in the records of this country had 36, 37% of the unemployed for more than 6 months. Never, never. This is a historic difference, and it matters for 2.5 million people. Treasury says if we don't act by the end of this year, there will be 3.9 million people unemployed for more than 6 months. without insurance. Also, we should remember what unemployment insurance did to pull people out of poverty. 11 million in a few years. And also, the evidence is clear that when people have no unemployment insurance, they tend to drop out of the labor market. And that's what's happening here. And that's bad for the economy. I plead with you to take another look. It's bad for the economy. It's bad for these individuals who send us letters. Just go home and talk with the people who've unemployed more than 6 months. Many of them tend to be older. They're having problems. They're working hard to find work. The Senate, on a bipartisan basis, passed unemployment insurance offset, and that was worked out. And the ball is now in our corner. So here we have this dramatic contrast of adding $310 billion to the deficit when we can't have a vote on a bill that would provide extended unemployment insurance without cost to the states that would cost about $10 or $11 billion.
All right, I think the gentleman has been, I've been very generous with the time because this is your second recognition, but let me just say, look, this program's run for 5.5 years. It's been extended 12 times. It's 2 years longer than any time prior in history. And at some point, temporary programs have to end. And we've never operated.
Talk about it.
You've had your time, but let me just say, I'm happy to talk about EUC, but that's not the bill that's before us.
Okay, let's.
The bill before us is actually a bill that we've had testimony before this committee that will create jobs, that will bring certainty to a program that is on again, off again, on again, off again. Some of our biggest trading partners like Canada have a permanent research and development tax credit. We've extended it 30 times without paying for it. I think 30 times is pretty permanent. The gentleman wants EUC permanent after 12 extensions. I'd like to see this permanent. I'd like to see this permanent.
Well, the gentleman, I'm not suggesting that it
well, you just want to keep extending it. But look,
no,
let's call it what
as long as we have a crisis.
I have the time. The gentleman has had his time.
You referred to me.
Let me just say that I think it's important that we extend this. This is a bipartisan bill. We've had people support this for many years, supporting permanency, not supporting a temporary extension. That's the bill that's been introduced. That's the bill that's before us. And I would just ask, are there any other questions for Mr. Barthold? Okay, there being no further questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 4438 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I request roll call vote.
The clerk will call the roll.
That's okay.
Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady. Aye. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan. Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Nunez. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry. Aye. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert. Aye. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani. Aye. Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom. Mr. Gerlach. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan. Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock. Aye. Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black. Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin. Mr. Renacci. Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Levin.
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel.
No.
Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. McDermott.
No.
Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal. Mr. Becerra. Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kind. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley. Mr. Crowley, no. Ms. Schwartz. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Roscom. Mr. Gerlach. You're not recorded, Mr. Roscom. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach. Mr. Griffin. Mr. Neal. Mr. Kind. Ms. Schwartz. Chairman Camp.
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
Okay. Make certain that you get the bass to come to be in that meeting. Listen, Karen Colvin now.
The clerk will report the vote.
22 ayes, 12 noes.
There being 22 ayes and 12 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 4438 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. The next order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Reichert and Mr. Kind related to built-in gains of S corporations. Mr. Reichert, you're now recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to thank Mr. Kind for co-sponsoring this important piece of legislation with me. As others have mentioned, since we started the tax reform process in January of 2011, one of the main themes coming up again and again is the need for certainty for individuals to plan businesses so they can thrive. Nowhere is this more true than for small or closely held businesses. Pass-through businesses account for more than half of all jobs in the United States, and in my home state of Washington, they are particularly important, providing 1.4 million jobs, 56% of our total workforce, with S corporations providing more than 1 in 4 private sector jobs. Permanence in the tax law is especially important for these privately held businesses because they can't go to the public markets every time they want to invest in new equipment or hire workers. They need certainty to plan how most effectively they deploy their capital. A perfect example of an area of the tax code that is ripe for permanence, so that S corporation businesses can plan to access and redeploy their own capital is the built-in gains or BIG relief provision before us today. The BIG tax is a double tax on S corporations that want to sell their appreciated assets after converting from C corporation status. Currently, S corporations have to wait 10 years after converting before selling their assets to avoid the punitive double tax. Traditional year-to-year tax extender legislation has reduced this holding period to 5 years, holding to the original anti-abuse intent of the rule, yet providing significant relief for business nationwide. This legislation, introduced by Mr. Kind and I, would permanently reduce the holding period to 5 years. As we've heard from Jim Redpath, an accountant from near Mr. Paulson's district, at the tax hearing several weeks ago, the big tax causes S corporations to hold on to unproductive or old assets that should be replaced. He gave the example of a road contractor that is holding on to old equipment and trucks sitting in the junkyard rather than selling them and being subject to the big double tax. Instead of selling assets and using the proceeds to hire new workers or invest in new equipment, the business owners sit on the sidelines. This is a perfect example of the tax code influencing business decisions, and it needs to stop. According to the IRS, tens of thousands of corporations convert to S corporations each year. We can't continue to leave this capital on the sidelines. We need to get it back to the small businesses that make this country thrive. And I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for including this important provision in the markup today, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Levin, you're now recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
Mr. Kind is delayed, first of all, getting out of Wisconsin, and then I think he was in the airport in Chicago, fogged in. I've already stated our position in terms of fiscal irresponsibility. It applies equally to this. I yield back.
The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 4453, which was distributed in advance. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of amendment. I will again turn to Mr. Tom Barthold to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and again ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Levin, you have before you JCX 39, which describes the underlying text of the legislation, and the green sheet JCX 4514, which describes the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. Just briefly reviewing what the legislation does. Upon conversion from a C corporation to an S corporation, the S corporation may have certain assets, the basis of which is determined by reference to the basis of the asset inside the C corporation. If that asset is, if a gain is recognized on such assets within the recognition period, an additional 35% tax applies to that gain. The recognition period in 2012 and 2013 was 5 years. That provision expired at the end of 2013, so that effective January 1st of this year, 2014, the recognition period is 10 years. The proposal before you would make as permanent law a 5-year recognition period.
Thank you. Any questions? All right, there being no further questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no further amendments or questions on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 4453 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on that I ask a roll call vote.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady? Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock. Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black. Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin. Mr. Renacci. Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Levin.
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel.
No.
Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. McDermott.
No.
Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis. No. Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal. Mr. Becerra. Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley. Mr. Crowley, no. Ms. Schwartz. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Ryan. Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Gerlach. Mr. Griffin. Mr. Neal. Mr. Kind. Ms. Schwartz. Chairman Camp.
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
21 yeas, 13 nays.
There being 21 ayes and 13 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 4553 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. And without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. The next order of business is another bill introduced by Mr. Reichert and Mr. Kind related to basis adjustments to stock of S corporations making charitable contributions of property. Mr. Reichert, you're now recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, this is a bipartisan effort by myself and Mr. Kind, and is part of the S Corporation Modernization Act, which brings stability and common sense to the tax code for S corporations. And I'll let Mr. Bartold get into the details of this bill, but simply the Permanent S Corporation Charitable Contribution Act makes permanent a provision that levels the playing field between S corporations and other types of businesses to ensure that S corporation owners are able to fully benefit from the value of their donations to charity. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Levin, you're recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
I'll simply repeat what I said before and emphasize that this approach is not a bipartisan approach. Having $310 billion unpaid for is not anything like bipartisanship. I yield back.
The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 4454, which was distributed in advance. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, The amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of amendment. Again, Mr. Barthold, we'll turn to you to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Again, we'll have member questions after your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Levin, you have before you Joint Committee Documents JCX 40, which describes the underlying text of the legislation, and JCX 46, the green sheet, which describes the Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. In brief, if an S corporation contributes money or property to a charity, each shareholder of the S corporation gets to take into account a pro rata share of that contribution in determining their own income tax liability. But the shareholder is required to make an adjustment to the basis in their S corporation stock. In years prior to the current year, the amount of the shareholder's basis reduction by reason of that contribution was equal to the shareholder's pro rata share of the adjusted basis of the property so contributed. Effective January 1st of this year, the reduction in the shareholder's basis in the stock is the pro rata share of the fair market value of the contributed property. The proposal before you would make permanent the basis rule that was applicable prior to this year, a reduction in basis by the pro rata share of the adjusted basis of the property. The Chairman's amendment provides a short title to that legislation.
All right, Mr. Barthold, would this not correct what is presently a disparity in the treatment between charitable contributions made by S corporations and partnerships?
Yes. In making a charitable contribution, the individual is generally of property. The individual is generally able to claim the fair market value as a deduction by adjusting the basis in the shareholder's stock. Essentially, you reduce the net effect of the net tax benefit of the charitable deduction.
And this basis adjustment rule, if you will, has been temporary in the past.
Yes,
and
that's
this
correct,
makes
sir.
it permanent. And would that not provide greater certainty and also then give the ability for long-term planning of charitable contributions as a result of its permanency?
Certainly in the case of S corporations, if the S corporation had a charitable gift program, it would certainly provide some certainty as to the value of those tax deductions.
All right, thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Barthold? All right, there being no questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 4454 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is unfavorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady? Aye. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan? Yes. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Nunes? Mr. Nunes, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock? Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin? Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel?
No.
Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. McDermott?
No.
Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, no. Ms. Schwartz? Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Griffin? Mr. Kind? Ms. Schwartz? Chairman Camp?
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
21 ayes, 14 noes.
There being 21 ayes and 14 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 4454 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. The next order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Tiberi and Mr. Kind related to Section 179 expensing limits. Mr. Tiberi, you're now recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this markup today. Pleased to have the opportunity to discuss such an important piece of legislation, which I introduced with Mr. Kind, America's Small Business Tax Relief Act. Legislation would permanently extend small business expensing for equipment and property outlined in Section 179 of the U.S. Tax Code. Section 179 allows small business owners to immediately deduct the cost of investments in property, equipment, and computer software rather than depreciating such cost over time. The bill would create stability, certainty, and simplicity for businesses by making permanent the $500,000 maximum expensing limit rather than the lower current law limit of $25,000, which is raised and dropped numerous times over the years. Making Section 179 permanent at the $500,000 level would reduce compliance costs for small businesses, reduce the cost of capital, and improve cash flow. This would allow small businesses to invest in their businesses, expand, and most importantly, create jobs. Continuously allowing the provision to expire like others that we continuously and temporarily extend make it difficult for small businesses to plan and adds confusion and complexity. I've heard from small businesses and farmers in Ohio that this important legislation will lead to economic growth and increased jobs. This bill is supported by groups like the NFIB, the Farm Bureau, and the Cattlemen's Association, just to name a few. I look forward to working with them and you, Mr. Chairman, and this committee to pass this legislation and make it permanent. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Levin, you're recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
As mentioned, Mr. Kind can't be here because of a delay in his airplane, but let me just reinforce what I said earlier. Democrats in many cases have supported 179. It's been an important provision, but this is now part of a package approach that adds $310 billion to the deficit being made permanent. And under those circumstances, we find it irresponsible to proceed this way. I yield back.
The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 4457, which was distributed in advance, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of amendment. Again, I'll turn to Mr. Barthold to provide the technical description of the amendment and the nature of a substitute. And again, we'll have questions after his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Levin. You have before you Joint Committee Documents JCX 41, which describes the underlying text of the legislation, and the green sheet JCX 47, which describes the Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. Since 2010, as Mr. Tiberi noted, under Section 179, taxpayers have been permitted to expense up to $500,000 of cost of qualifying property, that amount being phased out for qualifying property placed in service in excess of $2 million. But as of January of this year, the code reverts to prior law levels of $25,000 worth of qualifying property phased out for property placed in service in excess of $200,000 during the taxpayer's tax year. The proposal before you would make permanent the $500,000 and $500,000 annual expensing amount and the $2 million phase-out threshold. It would index both of those provisions. It would also make permanent what has been temporary treatment of including as qualifying property off-the-shelf computer software. It would make permanent qualified real property to be eligible under Section 179, and it would further clarify that air conditioning and heating property is qualifying property. The Chairman's amendment makes a clerical correction to the underlying legislation to enable it to function properly.
All right, any questions for Mr. Barthold? All right, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 4457 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. No. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I ask for a recorded vote.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson.
It's been too long waiting.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady. Aye. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan. Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Nunez. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Tiberi. Mr. Tiberi, aye. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani. Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan. Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock. Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black. Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin? Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. McDermott? Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, no. Ms. Schwartz? Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Griffin? Mr. Kind? Ms. Schwartz? Chairman Camp?
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
21 ayes, 14 noes.
There being 21 ayes and 14 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 4457, as amended, is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives, and without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. The next order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Teaberry and Mr. Neal related to the Subpart F exception for active financing income. Mr. Teaberry, you're now recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I introduced this legislation with Mr. Neal, my counterpart in the Select Revenue Measures Subcommittee. It has significant bipartisan support, including 7 Democrats on the committee. The bill would make permanent the temporary provisions that treat income from active overseas financial services operations of U.S. companies the same as all other American business income earned abroad. The FE rules historically have had broad bipartisan support and are necessary to maintain the competitiveness of U.S.-based financial service industries and of manufacturing companies that rely on financial services arms to provide financing for their products sold abroad. The provisions ensure that these U.S. taxpayers, like other U.S. businesses competing overseas, are subject to the U.S. tax on active business income earned abroad by their foreign subsidiaries only when this income is brought home to the United States. Without this provision, U.S. companies would have to pay a cost that is not borne by their overseas competitors whose home countries do not tax financial services income earned abroad. These additional costs would translate into competitive disadvantages for U.S. companies with thousands of jobs at stake. By making this provision permanent, we won't be leaving U.S. companies in limbo every year as what to do that the U.S. tax rules are for their foreign earnings. Many who criticize the AFE provisions don't quite understand the rigorous nature of the AFE qualification rules and requirements. The active financing rules do not provide deferral for any profits made in the United States, and in fact, they explicitly deny deferral for any income earned from businesses with U.S. customers. The AFE rules go to great lengths to ensure that the companies have to be located where their customers are. The rules are designed to ensure that financial services companies are engaged in true, ongoing financial services businesses. When the tests in the AFE rules are met, they provide the same treatment that non-financial U.S. companies doing business outside the U.S. receive. The provision of financial services is inherently a local business. To make loans, to sell insurance, to provide credit, or lease machinery, the business has to be where the customers are. U.S. financial service companies cannot serve foreign markets without having an active foreign presence. Furthermore, tens of thousands of jobs at U.S. headquarters and U.S. offices around the country support the businesses of serving global consumers around the world. This is true in my state, big time. Without the AFE rules, our U.S. companies would be less competitive, and jobs here at home, including in my state, would be jeopardized. Mr. Chairman, thanks again for holding this markup. Thanks for your leadership. Thank you for allowing us to talk about important tax policy that we'd like to make permanent. I look forward to discussion and yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Levin, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you,
on the
Mr.
bill.
Chairman. This is a provision that needs consideration. It's an important part of our looking at our international tax provisions. It was considered within the chairman's tax reform proposal, but not part of a package that would add $310 billion to the deficit of the United States of America. Therefore, I repeat my opening statement about the irresponsibility of proceeding in this manner And I yield back.
The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 4429, which was distributed in advance. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of amendment. Again, I'll turn to Mr. Barthold to provide a technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and we'll have questions after his presentation. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Levin, you have before you JCX 37, which describes the underlying text of the legislation, and the green sheet JCX 43, which describes the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. In brief, the so-called active financing exception, which expired at the end of 2013, provided a temporary exception from the foreign personal holding company income, from foreign base company services income, and insurance income that otherwise apply under subpart F of the code for income that's derived from the active conduct of a banking, financing, or similar businesses, securities dealers, or in the conduct of insurance businesses. The proposal before you would make that active financing exception of prior law permanent. The chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute provides a short title to that legislation.
All right, thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Barthold?
I have a question, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Thompson.
What's the cost of this over 10?
Mr. Thompson, as reported in our documents, we've estimated that relative to the present law baseline, it would lose $58.8 billion.
$58 billion, thank you.
Are there any other questions? There being no further questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 4429 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady.
Aye.
Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan.
Aye.
Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Nunez. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani. Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock. Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black. Oh, Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin. Mr. Renacci. Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel. Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. McDermott. Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra. Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley. Mr. Crowley, no. Ms. Schwartz. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Griffin? Mr. Kind? Ms. Schwartz? Chairman Camp?
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
21 yeas, 14 nays.
There being 21 ayes and 14 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 4429 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views so ordered. The last order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Bustani and Mr. Kind related to CFC look-through rules. Mr. Bustani, you're now recognized for an opening statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased we're marking up this bill to make the CFC look-through permanent, and I want to thank Mr. Kind for championing the effort with me, as well as our committee colleagues for co-sponsoring a bipartisan measure like this. The rule allows American companies doing business worldwide to deploy capital from one foreign subsidiary to another foreign subsidiary in an efficient manner without triggering negative U.S. tax consequences. This is a very important step to ensure the tax laws of this country put our American companies on a level playing field with their foreign competitors who are not subject to an onerous worldwide tax system.
Okay.
CFC look-through would allow payments of dividends, interest, rents, or royalties in the normal course of active business operations between U.S.-owned foreign subsidiaries to remain deployed in the business without an immediate U.S. tax burden. It does not apply to passive, highly mobile income. And in fact, a Baker & McKinsey tax partner recently explained at our April 8th hearing that, I quote, CFC look-through allows a U.S. business to align the tax treatment of the global enterprise with the business. Yeah. Many businesses conduct their affairs by business segment or line of business, and CFC look-through helps eliminate separate entity limitations, thereby allowing a business to truly operate globally by segment or line of business, end quote. So without this look-through rule, U.S. companies would need to waste time and resources on creating tax-efficient management structures rather than producing products, creating value, and creating good American jobs. The CFC look-through provision enables greater competitiveness and simplified business planning for American companies with activities being conducted abroad. And when Congress enacted the provision in 2006, it wisely recognized it would result in similarly situated taxpayers being treated equally. Because of CFC look-through, worldwide American companies can do as their foreign counterparts can do and redeploy active foreign earnings for efficient use in their activities and their business operations. Mr. Chairman, I urge a yes vote on H.R. 4464.
All right, thank you. Mr. Levin, you're recognized for an opening statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is another important provision. It isn't without some controversy, though I think there is considerable support for it or some version thereof. Once again, we're talking about a part of a $310 billion addition to our deficit. Mr. Kind could not be here, and so I would ask that his statement be put in the record, including on this one. He concludes by saying, while he supports these provisions, I cannot vote to add $310 billion to our nation's deficit. I welcome a bipartisan discussion on plausible offsets. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 4464, which was distributed in advance. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. Again, Mr. Barthold, we'll turn to you to provide a technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and we'll have questions again after your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Levin, the members have before them JCX 42, which describes the underlying legislation, and the green sheet JCX 48, which describes the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. In short, prior to this year, the look-through rule provided that dividends, interest, rents, royalties received by one controlled foreign corporation from a related foreign corporation would not be treated as foreign personal holding company income and thereby not subject to current income tax inclusion under Subpart F of the Code by the payee controlled foreign corporation, provided that such payments were neither Subpart F income nor effectively connected income of the payor controlled foreign corporation. The proposal before you would make that prior law rule permanent. The chairman's amendment, the nature of a substitute, provides a short title for that legislation.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Bartold?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. T-Berry.
Quick question. Mr. Bartold, can you, since there's been concern about adding to the deficit, can you tell us how much the R&D tax credit has cost, the cost of it since it's been extended from what I understand when I was in high school the first time?
The total amount claimed over the past 30 years?
Since it's been extended.
I'll have to respond to the committee separately. I don't have that at my fingertips, Mr. T-Berry, but I wouldn't want to hazard a guess, but I will respond to the committee.
Thank you.
Certainly more than $300 billion.
We've estimated it in excess of, over recent years, in excess of $10 billion annually.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell. Well, the questions are really directed to Mr. Bartold, but if you want to state your question, maybe we can get somebody to answer for you.
So the fact that we have a 30-year history, I was going to say 40 years, Mr. T-Bar, 30 years since you were in high school. But anyway, friend, when you take, how much money this brought in, what we're talking about is using taxpayers' money from across the board to pay for it. I mean, how much it costs the taxpayers. We're not just talking about those who took advantage of R&D or in foreign corporations. We're talking about folks who had to pay for it, like you and me and Mr. T-Berry. So I think that's the proper form of the question about how much taxpayers had to front, how much they had to pay in order for this program to continue. We like the program. The question is, how long are we going to continue it? And if it's permanent, what will it cost us after 10 years, after 20 years, and what are the benefits of the program?
Will the gentleman yield?
Who's paying the tax?
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
My point is that this provision has been extended since I was in high school. That's a long time ago, Mr. Pascrell. And so it's cost money over that period of time. It's something that both parties have obviously supported. But because of the fact it's not permanent, it creates uncertainty among people who use it to the benefit of growing the economy. That was my point. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. T-Berry.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Doggett.
Mr. Barthol, what is the dollar and cents unpaid cost of making it permanent, passing this bill and making this particular bill permanent?
Mr. Doggett, our estimate, which is provided on JCX 48 before you, is that over the current 10-year budget period, we estimate a revenue loss of $20.3 billion for the CFC look-through.
That's
provision.
B with a billion, not a
yes,
million.
Billion, sir.
$20
Yes.
billion
Yes,
for
sir.
controlled foreign corporations. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Bartold, at the end of 2012, beginning of 2013, there was a fairly significant tax measure that moved through. Was that quote-unquote paid for?
No, sir. The extenders were not offset in that legislation.
And there were some permanent provisions in that tax package as well, were there not? Certainly in the estate and gift tax area and others.
Yes. On the individual income tax side on rates.
And as has been pointed out repeatedly, we've often not paid for, in fact, more often than not, by a fairly significant margin, not quote-unquote raise taxes in other parts of the tax code to extend current law.
There have been a number of times where the Congress has made that decision.
And does not the president's budget also suggest making tax provisions, some tax provisions permanent without paying for them?
No.
I'm not quite sure how to characterize all of the president's budget, since there's a whole lot of.
Well, there are tax measures in the
But there are.
president's budget, are there not?
Yes, sir.
And they're not paid for, are they?
Not directly lined up.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Are there any further questions for Mr. Barthold?
I just want the record clear.
Wait, are you asking to be recognized?
Yes.
Mr. Levin's recognized. But we do have to have some order in the committee.
No, I think we have plenty of order. I think we've proceeded in a very orderly fashion.
You're on the clock.
Chairman. Mr. Barthold, I just, you answered not directly. I don't want to get into an argument with you. You were asked a question. The president's budget did not, in terms of those provisions, when you say they didn't pay for, they were part of an overall budget that tended to the deficit. So that's all I want to point out. You were careful to say not directly.
Right. All right.
We have never permanently extended these, and unassailable is this cost of $310 billion just the next 10 years. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Are there any other questions for Mr. Barthold? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? All right. If there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. In the opinion of the chair, the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 4464 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady.
Aye.
Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan. Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Nunez. Aye. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry. Aye. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani. Aye. Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom. Aye. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach. Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price. Thanks. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan. Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock. Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black. Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin. Mr. Renacci. Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Levin.
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel. No. Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. McDermott. No. Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis. No. Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra. Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson. Oh, Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley. Mr. Crowley, no. Ms. Schwartz. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Griffin. Mr. Kind. Ms. Schwartz. Chairman Camp.
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
22 ayes, 14 noes.
There being 22 ayes and 14 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 4464 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views so ordered. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.